for tonight, which is fairly straightforward. Number 4 is the main one, but first we're going to review a bit of what the Charter Committee's work has been up to today, and then following that we'll review some of the process, both that we're going through in order to review it, and then also to talk about what the next steps would be in terms of what the process for amending the charter would be. And then 3 and 4 are what we're here for. So public comments, and we're going to listen to what everyone has to say. So we don't have great many people here right now, but we do have a sign-up sheet by the door. We had thought that might be for making comments, but I don't think we're going to need that tonight. So if you can just sign up to let Nancy hear. And I will introduce myself as Robert Plunkett. I'm the co-chair of the Charter Review Committee.
And I'm Sean Marie Oler.
I'm Dan Mallenborn.
I'm Lynn Green.
John Cohen.
Robert Ebert.
Michael Keane.
Nancy Lyman, Secretary.
And so in terms of reviewing the progress, I'm going to defer to Sean Marie in terms of going over what we've done so far. And just so everyone knows, our progress is reflected in the minutes that are on the Town of Bennington website in our little section, but Sean Marie will just give a brief overview of what we've done.
And anyone certainly can chime in. This was not to necessarily give detail, like line by line, but what we have been doing since July is going through the document from beginning to end and making both grammatical changes as well as language that may not be needed because the law might cover it. So we've put in where it applies to the law. I think in the letter that was in the paper, it referred to some of the areas that we were focusing on in terms of the town manager section and in terms of the place we got feedback on the article that was written a month or so ago about the fire department shall be volunteer or paid. We also dealt with a section about a constable, which I understand we haven't had one in many, many years. And we refer to in the document to the select board versus selectors or select board members, because it is in fact the select board has the governing body, not an individual board member. So those were just some of the sort of a little bit of the overview. There is a lot of just reformatting some of it, which all the citizens, the voters will vote on it, even if they're just grammatical changes or taking something out that is no longer relevant. And what I mean by that, so people don't think I'm being frivolous about being relevant, but there's a section that talks about voting on the downtown district, which was voted on and passed and is now just a reference note versus that it's part of the charter. So those are the kind of things that I'm referring to when I speak that way. We've made it through section 5. The committee has voted after each section, up or down, the group, the 7 of us, whether we agree with the changes or not. That's all reflected in the minutes. The section 5, however, we did not vote on, even though we did talk about changes because we felt we needed more information from the contractor who is contracted to do the downtown development. It has a different name now. And so that's really where we're at. We're here to listen to reactions to what you may have read in the paper or what you've read online in the minutes. And did I do enough of a broad stroke?
I think most of the changes were grammatical and tried to eliminate what we felt was unnecessary language, but we did agree to propose some substantive changes I don't know if we're going to go through those in detail, but for the most part, I would say it's been to clean up the document, but there have been some proposals for some substantive changes.
And those would refer to both the, as I mentioned in the letter that was published, I think yesterday maybe, that I think most of us on the committee felt that there was, that we needed, the charter needed to be strengthened in terms of accountability for both the select board members and the town manager. So I don't think Mr. Therian was at the meeting where we talked about putting in language that reflected that in terms of evaluations, in terms of the length of a contract, and those will all be highlighted in the changes when they get proposed to the select board. And so that would probably lead us into the process of where we go when this committee finishes its work.
Can I say something?
Sure.
I think I don't want to minimize the substantive discussions that we've had, though, because some of the substantive discussions we've had, we wanted to wait to make the final recommendation until we heard from the public. So some of the things, the big things like local options, taxes, and form of government, we did want to get that input before we, completely made our recommendation. But we've had some good, long, hard discussions on some of these.
Which, again, I don't mean to minimize by saying that we've made just some changes. There will be documented on the document where we made changes, so the public will be able to see the changes, and our hope is that there will be an explanation from the committee as to why and what the discussion was around changing that section. In addition, do you or Michael want to talk about the process that will go to the select board?
In terms of our review, does Michael or Robert, do you have any comments on what we've done so far? I just wanted to mention what we've gone through is there are different chapters in the charter. We've gone through the first 5, and the first one, just so everyone's aware, the first is the powers of the town. The second is the officers of the town. The third is the chapter about the select board. Fourth is the chapter about the town manager, and the fifth one is a broad taxation chapter, and those are the 5 general areas that we've reviewed in terms of the charter. But in terms of the process going forward, what we're going to come up with at the end of our process is a final report that we'll be presenting to the select board in terms of our recommendations. And Michael can talk a little bit about what we expect the report to look like. But once that report is submitted to the select board then discusses whether or not they are going to recommend those changes. And if those changes are then recommended, after that, there's actually a long series of procedures that they must go through. But primarily that is that there's 2 required public hearings before there's a vote in the town on up or down on any changes to the charter. And Michael, did you have anything that you wanted to say about the report?
Yeah,
it's not drafted yet.
No, just the draft report. A couple of things. Number one of the things we want to strive to do is make the report reflect, as has already been mentioned, 2 things. A clear section on any substantive changes. Changes, for example, that might have to do with a contract basis for the town manager. Changes that might have to do, that will have to do, in fact, with excessive absences of members of select boards, for example, so that citizens have full representation on the board. There'll also be a section that deals with what Sean Marie just talked about, those minor changes that you make for grammatical reasons and for reasons of consistency. In the document that we have and are working from, the document uses almost indiscriminately the word selector, selector board, select board members. We're trying to make that consistent for the select board all the way through. And anywhere we find inconsistencies that are either grammatical or by usage, we're changing those to make them consistent. That will be a part of the report that the select board can track and see where the changes have been made. When it comes to substantive changes, and let's say a contract, specific contract of a certain number of years for town manager, or a paragraph about how to deal with potential excessive absences of select board members, then we'll have the narrative. Basically, we'll have what we have decided as a recommendation to the select board and the rationale for it. That makes sense? That's really it. I'm in the process of putting together what we have done so far, and you guys will see that tomorrow afternoon.
So I expect that the public comments and the listening, there might be some back and forth, but primarily what we're asking or looking for is any comments that anyone has for us, suggestions on anything in the charter in general. So since we don't have very many people here, I just ask whomever may want to make a comment to step up to the table and at the mic, and we'll take your comments. It seems like it may be a very short meeting since everyone is here to hear everybody else's comments. And as I forgot, please state your name so that we know who you are.
And you want me to sit here?
Yes.
Okay. I like to follow instructions. It's the way my mother raised me. My name is, well, Margaret, but I go by Maggie Dermody Pendergast. First thing I would like to say is a thank you. This could not have been an easy task. And frequently, you probably hear more negatives than positives, and people don't like change. And I just want to say, as a member of Pennington, thank you for all your effort in probably a very thankless job. I've read some of the things, and I'm very pleased, and I was sort of surprised that some of these, and I only returned here in 2002. I was raised here, left in '65, and came back in 2002. I was surprised that some of these things that you had mentioned, ideas that you've come up with, haven't been addressed before, but they may have been, and I just don't know about it. I do believe the idea of select board, there should be checks and balances. I do believe the idea of the absentee. I was quite surprised that that would be an issue, since I would think if you're an elected person, this is not a volunteer. And in any job, if you're being paid, no matter what, you do, at times, have to be held accountable if you don't have a valid reason for being absent.
Maggie, can I just comment on something about that?
Sure.
One thing that we thought of when we were discussing this was that maybe a select board member could be absent from meetings as a political device, and that maybe it's possible that somebody could almost run on the platform that he would not attend the meetings. And I mean, that's just an example of the type of discussions that we've gone through on every section of the changes or proposed changes that we've been through. So I just, you know,
kudos to you for being so
like an hour
aware.
Just discussing that.
Yes, so. I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah. And I believe in any type of business, organization, you must have checks and balances, so I do like that. I continue to like the format of the select board. I'm not a pro-mayor person. I like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. No, I like the way it seems to be running. But I do like to have, how do I say that? Recommendations. It's always, to me, a positive when someone comes in with a suggestion or saying, well, should we put a time limit? Is there, should we have a review if you've been in charge of something for any amount of years? I think I don't know of any other position that doesn't have an overview at some point, that you are not asked to either give a report or that type of thing. So, once again, thank you. I'm enjoying listening to this. Thank you for your effort.
I just want to add to what Dan wisely spoke about. We also discussed the fact that if a select board member cannot, for whatever the reason, physically be present in the room for a meeting, that person can attend by electronic means. So we've got that, we have that covered as well. This isn't meant to exclude anyone, it's meant to encourage people to participate.
If I could just add one more thing. Maggie, you mentioned that any time someone's been there a long period of time. Another thing we discussed was term limits for select board members. And just because we ultimately didn't recommend a change for that doesn't mean we didn't thoroughly discuss that and look at what other towns do, et cetera. So, but I think your point is well taken on checks and balances. So,
thank you.
And I'm going to jump off of what Lynn said. When you started off where you were surprised that some of the things hadn't been reviewed before. Quite frankly, we don't know. We don't necessarily have all of the minutes, frankly, or the records from when it's been reviewed before. But one of the things, and one of the reasons why we're going through it line by line, is that even the things that we're not changing, we're trying to consider whether or not there should be a change there. Although much of it is obviously not going to be changed. It's something where we wanted to review everything and have a record that we're going to be reviewing it so that 45 years from now, that someone can take a look at it and say, oh, they looked at it back then. Is there anyone else that has a comment that they want to make now? Tom?
Thank you very much. I'm going to sit in the hot seat that I always invite folks to.
You're usually not there.
I just want to introduce myself as Tom Jacobs, and citizen, and just wanted to also just show up and offer my appreciation on behalf of the board and the town. I hope you don't find this task as thankless, because this is a living document provided by and for living people. And this document that you've been spending so much time on is basically what's going to give us the future of our community. I have a spirit of enthusiasm and optimism for our community, and seeing the way you've gone about your task, you've lived up to that. Now, whether or not my colleagues jump on board with all the suggestions, that's to be determined. And I think that's good, because we'll have an open dialogue inviting the community into that participation. The hope is and was that it'll be presented in time so we can talk about it at the annual meeting and vote. Actually, when we talked about the committee, I had my doubts whether or not that would happen, but hearing some of the members, John Cohen saying, I'm not signing on for life, I can see that you've given a lot of your life for these couple of months that you've been involved with this document. As I said, this is a living document. It governs our activities. We can't wait another 15 years to revisit it. It's something that the select boards of the future should look at it, because the state of Vermont has given us certain opportunities, and we should run with it. And that's really what you're doing, and I think what our select board will too. But again, thanks for all of the effort. I don't want to comment on specifics because I'll have my opportunity as well as my colleagues, but continue the good work. And I can see the town management has been very supportive I've read all of the minutes, and it's obvious that you've gotten that support. But if there are any other additional needs, feel free to let us know. Again, thank you very much.
One thing that we didn't ask for is that there are lunch meetings, so we didn't ask for you to supply lunch to us.
It's not too late.
It's not too late. One thing that Tom did bring up is having the recommendations that we will be presenting to the select board as something that could be voted on at the town meeting next year. The time frame on our presenting those recommendations to the select board and then the select board approving them and putting them to public hearing is fairly short at this point. We'd have to do this sometime in December. We'll be discussing exactly how we're going to be doing that, whether it's going to be something where we'll present everything or parts of it at that time. Robert.
But I would like to point out that the charter itself gives us a year to do this work. We began in late July. If we can have this done in time for March, that's a great thing, but that is not the motivator in this. We have a full year to go over this, and it will take as long as it takes up to that point.
I will add, though, that we were hoping to get through it, hence we meet every single week, and it is during, it's 11:45 to 1, and usually it's a little more, and Dan's late to get back, and this one's late to get there, and we all try to accommodate it so that we can move through it weekly and not let it sit, and then we come with having read it and suggestions. And I was trying to think of a suggestion that I might talk about, which I think shows the level of taking a look at this document, as Tom said, as a living document. And one thing that really struck with me is that Lynn had brought up in the section, I don't know what section we're in, section 3, about relating to additional powers that the select board members have, which is to adopt ordinances. And one of the things that came up was intrusive technology, like drones. And this was never included in previous charters. It was not really an issue 10, 15 years ago that you could have a drone flying over your house and your fence with a little camera on it. And I give Lynn a lot of credit for saying, well, what about these kind of things to be added into ordinances that also relate to, you know, they can do relating to the use of firearms in settled areas. I mean, it's just one of the number of things that we looked at under additional powers for the select board, that they could make these kinds of rules related to these things. So I just wanted to, you know, I think I might have sounded a little like, oh, we're just going through it and not making substantive changes, because that's really not the case. I think, as somebody had said, we may spend 2 hours talking about something over 2 weeks and then decide that it doesn't need to be changed because we've heard from enough people and that we've asked Stu or Dan to bring us information on how something works, just like we've asked the Downtown Bennington Alliance?
Bennington Downtown Alliance?
Bennington Downtown Alliance to come and speak to us, because I think a number of us really didn't understand exactly what they do and what that contracted service is. So I think where we don't know something, we've reached out to whoever it could be to bring us the information.
Just clarify one thing. When you said use of settled arms or firearms in settled areas, that's currently in the charter. But that's where the section that it came up in. And so our discussion really went as broad as the last charter was revised in 2005, so 12 years ago. We thought, what do the next 12 years hold? We didn't have e-cigarettes then. We didn't have, I mean, all kinds of things. The drones, I can't even remember all the things we talked about.
Vapes.
Yeah, and so we didn't include all of those itemized, but the concept is giving the flexibility to the select board for it, what we've researched and found is just invasive technologies. So that was one recommendation.
And I think that we have appropriately decided to not make changes when we felt that we didn't have enough information to accurately assess the proposed change. I think that we concluded that we shouldn't, if we don't have adequate information, that's probably not a decision that we're prepared to make, and that we should leave it to the select board or to the voters to draft a petition for that type of change.
Oh, there's got to be more comments.
Well, are there any more comments right now? If there aren't, Stu.
It's not really a comment, but I think it's important to note. I'm Stuart Hurd, Town Manager. One of the things that you folks didn't mention about the charter and its authority, it is really the constitution of the community. The charter, in fact, gives, if you choose to do so, and if the town chooses to vote that way, it gives additional authority to the select board to take on things that might otherwise not be provided by statute. And I think that's really important. For instance, the Bennington Select Board is a 7-member board. The statute contemplates only a 3 or a 5-member select board. So we are unique in that our charter provides for 7 members. And I think that's important for the community to understand that the work that you're doing is not only looking at things that we haven't contemplated in the past and perhaps changing some of the arcane language that exists in the charter, but also understanding what things this gives us that the state law does not. And that's why I think the charter is such a very important document. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
And anyone else who's here? I'm going to go over some of the substantive changes, just kind of broad overviews of things that we might be doing. Hopefully that might spur something that, and I reviewed it today, and as John had mentioned, much of it, what we're doing is cleaning up the language so that it's actually functional. But really the first substantive change, it's also partially a grammatical change, is in terms of the recall of the elected officers. Right now, there's a deadline for a recall petition of 15 days. It's unclear exactly how that would work. So one of our recommendations is to remove that deadline. So in a way, our recommendation is going to make it somewhat easier to recall an elected official, assuming we don't rediscuss that and change it before the final report. But this is just some of what we're going over at this point. Another, and I believe this was mentioned by Sean Murray, is that there's a requirement that the select board appoint a constable, and that has simply not been done. And one of our recommendations is to remove that. Also to clean up the language in terms of how the listers are appointed, and also how their terms are essentially chosen. It's going to give more leeway to the select board from the 3 to 5 to 2 to 5, I believe we have. And also the select board will be able to just determine what their terms are. And one thing, this isn't actually a substantive issue, but in terms of the uniqueness of Bennington, this was something that I actually felt strongly about not changing, is that our select board is referred to as the select board. It's 2 words. Every other town has 1 word, select board, but we're a little bit different. And that name sets us apart, and I think that name is something that was important for me to keep. Because we have a lot of the history here, and that's part of it. That was part of the initial substantive rewrite of the charter. And I forget the exact date, but from the 60s. So Sean Marie had mentioned the additional power in terms of giving the town the power to regulate technologies. We describe them as intrusive technologies, but that's something that I don't believe any other town in Vermont has, and I know that the legislature itself has discussed it. But that's one of the recommendations we expect to make, is giving our town the power to simply do that. One that had led to a a fair amount of discussion was that right now our fire department is required to be a volunteer fire department. And the issue arose of whether or not we would want to pay them for what they do. And one of the recommendations, at least that we had discussed so far, though we're going to be discussing it again, is making it so that it could be a paid fire department. And the intent of that was simply to pay people for the good things that they do. But that's a fairly big discussion that we've had with some of the firefighters, and it's on our agenda for our long meeting tomorrow night. Go ahead, Charmer.
Well, I was going to say, because we did get a lot of feedback on the article that was written about paid versus volunteer, and it really, it came about through a fairly, as Rob said, long discussion about what if there was a need to pay drivers? What if there was a need to contract with a fire department across state line? And we fully expect that it will continue as a volunteer department, but should they be able, that there's a need to arise, that the select board would have the authority to be able to do that. I think that it's been shared with us that there are, plenty of volunteer firemen and they're trained, and that, it's been working well. And it just came out of a suggestion from one of the members on this committee that, perhaps we should look at it. Now, as Rob said, we're going to rediscuss it because we did get a lot of feedback on it, and we'll see where it goes, because this is not our final recommendation. This is just where we're at today.
And given the fact that it's been 12 years since it was last changed, if that need arose, the town's hands would be tied as far as trying to implement that if it were still codified in the charter.
And just some of the others that we've discussed, as was brought up, the absenteeism issue with the select board. We're going to make a recommendation that there be a means of removal. Also, we're going to recommend the select board be required to review their own procedures of conduct annually. So they'll have to look at themselves and self-regulate in some ways. Also, as had been mentioned earlier, recommendation of a term for the town manager that can be renewed, but it has to be renewed. So the select board would have to review the town manager and make a decision after a period of time, but without, also, we have a very broad ability to remove the town manager. None of that would change. It would just simply be an affirmative necessity every 3 years or whenever the contract expires. And we hadn't actually voted on any of the taxation issues, so we don't, I can't really say that we've already decided that these are the recommendations so far that we're going to be putting forward, but one that we had talked about that I believe, and I may be speaking too soon for this, but I believe we'll be recommending is that right now there's a downtown improvement district, which is essentially a taxation district. There's basically a line in downtown where certain properties are taxed, and right now the charter requires a full town vote to change the boundaries. Our recommendation, I think, is going to be to give that authority to the select board rather than to a full town vote. And another aspect of that same district, and I might be speaking way too early on this, but right now there's an exception to the properties in that zone that would be taxed, as that residential properties are not. Our recommendation, I believe, is going to be to change that so that rental properties would be taxed, but owner residential properties would be part of the exception at that point. And frankly, I defer to the other members if there's any other substantive issues that we seem to be recommending.
I just wanted to point out to highlight, because I think a couple of the changes that you mentioned folks would be particularly interested in. Removal from the select board would be if a member is absent from 4 consecutive warned meetings or is absent for more than 50% of warned meetings in any 6-month period. So that's what our current recommendation is, and I don't think you mentioned that the select board or the town manager term would be a 3-year term that could be renewed for successive 3-year terms for however many 3-year terms the select board chose to renew, but the term is a 3-year term, and I think Lynn wants to address the taxation issue.
Oh, I was just going to say we had pretty lengthy discussion about the local options tax, and if anyone has any just thoughts on that or even hand raising on that, that's valuable input as well as to whether you have given any thought to that, whether you think that's a positive thing or not.
Because that's not something we've made a decision on. We're still contemplating that.
And there are, I didn't bring with me, but there are a whole lot of other towns that do have that. We're one of the few larger towns that doesn't have that, I believe.
Does everybody know what a local option tax is? So a local option tax is where the town would take, 1%, so the sales tax is 6%. Or what is it now?
Or meals.
Meals and rooms are 9, alcohol is 10, and sales and use is 6.
So it would add a percent to whichever one of these taxes. I think you could define it, right? That it would just be room and meals. It would be sales, and then half of that money goes upstate and half of the money comes back.
70% comes back.
See, I needed everybody to help me.
70 is surrendered to the state.
I think we were, as Lynn said, I think we asked for a lot more information on it, which towns got it. Not every town could apply for it either. We could also give that authority to the select board to use and to figure out how they would get approval either in whatever fashion they wanted. So I think, who wants to give a little history about how the gold towns could, it was originally for the towns when, which act was it?
60.
60? When Act 60 went into existence, a lot of the gold towns were sending money upstate on education taxes, and they weren't getting all of it back, whereas Bennington is a receiving town where they send up the dollars they collect and they actually get more back in return. So the legislature let those gold towns exercise an option tax, and if anybody thinks that I'm wrong, please correct me. I do not want to be giving wrong information. And so that's when that particular law went into place for the local option tax. But now it's open to all towns. You have to apply for it. So.
No, Stu is shaking.
No, Stu, you better go over there and explain for me. Because I think it would, we have talked about it and not decided what we're going to recommend.
Well, so far, Sean Marie, you're correct.
Good. So you take over.
Gold towns were by law offered the opportunity to have their voters vote to impose a local option sales tax. One town that we're all familiar with that did that and was successful is Manchester. And they receive 70% of the monies that are collected by that 1%. 30% stays with the state of Vermont. In Bennington, we were not allowed to consider that option because we were a receiving town. So we were prohibited by law. And over the last decade, Senator Sears, on our behalf, has been attempting to change that law so that receiving towns could, in fact, impose one or other or all of the taxes that we've discussed here, the option taxes, the various option taxes. In Bennington, it would probably, the local option sales tax, because we are a regional shopping center and because we serve people from New York State, from Massachusetts, as well as from outside of the town of Bennington with our regional shopping network, would more than likely generate somewhere in the range of $700,000 to $900,000 a year that would come to the town of Bennington that the select board would then be able to use as it sees fit or as it asks the voters to allow it to use. And at the present time, we don't have that option by law. The legislature has been unwilling to open that door to towns that receive heavy amounts of state aid education. And the only towns that have successfully been allowed to have it happen have changed their charters to create the tax in one form or another. And you folks had the information of the number of towns that have done that. And that seems to be the only avenue that is available to Bennington. And if in fact you recommend it and the select board adopts that change and it is there subsequently voted by the voters, then the town would have the authority to impose one or the other of those local option taxes as the select board has been approved by the voters. Board cannot do it on its own. The voters must accept the change before it can be done. And obviously we as staff have been pushing for years to try to get the legislature to at least allow our voters to have a say, because we do provide all of the infrastructure that everybody else uses to come to our community and to use our roads and use our facilities, and yet they're not helping us pay for them. And the local option sales tax ideally would be one way to do that. So our only path to the local option sales tax or any of the other local option taxes is through a charter amendment.
And everyone should keep in mind that whatever recommendations this committee makes goes to the select board, then on to the voters, but also to the state legislature. Because no matter what gets sent up to the legislature, they can do essentially what they please to do with the charter as it's proposed. They could basically add or remove or not accept any changes at all. So we could, by the end of this process, we could end up with a 2005 charter that we have now, or some variation of what we suggest.
Correct.
So Don, this could all be done for nothing, as I'm sure you have some sympathy for it.
It's an exercise well worth taking, because the folks in the legislature are very receptive to hearing from the population.
Yeah.
It's very important.
And actually, it's interesting in terms of that final step. After the select board recommends it, the voters approve it, it does go to the legislature. And when it goes to the legislature, the law changed this year to include that all of our minutes from the review, all of the select board minutes, and basically all of the information that led to why these changes are going to be recommended has to go up to the legislature. So they're going to be scrutinizing how we went through the process if there's something that's ultimately sent to the legislature. Interesting. So with all of those substantive issues that we've talked about, did that spur any further comments or questions or statements? Or? Can I
ask a question?
Of course, Robert.
Does anybody think Bennington should have a mayor?
That's a way to say.
Is anyone willing to tell us why you think Bennington should have a mayor? The distinguished gentleman in blue.
Thank you. My name is Bruce Learman. I live here in the town of Bennington. I'm not going to tell you whether I think we ought to have a mayor or not, but there is something I think that the discussion about governance particularly has focused more for me, and that is that there's a paradox here where there's a town to be managed and administered, and there's a town to be led. And there's a difference between management and leadership. And I think the management of the town, the Act 60 and the Local Options Act is a good example of how complex the management part has become over the last couple of decades. You have requirements to meet and mandates to meet from all levels, from the state and the federal government. And it takes, to me, a experienced and educated professional to deal with those issues. And that would tend to lead toward a town manager form of government. But then there's a question of leadership. And I think the sort of nagging sensation in a lot of the public is that what Bennington lacks is that person, is that role who has the responsibility for establishing leadership and a vision for where the community is going. Now, I see these as two separate things. I think confounding the management role with an electoral role, an elected official who has to satisfy a constituency within the public would be a very big mistake, because I don't think you would attract the kind of professional who really can do the job of managing the town under current regulations and restrictions and take on the task of being elected every 4 years. However, I do feel that the person who, or the role that is leadership for the town is something that does fit an elected position. It's something where you would build a constituency for the vision you have for the town. And that's, I think, the image we have of a mayor. Although I do think that, as I say, in this day and age, I think the idea of an elected mayor who can deal with all the administrative and managerial issues is, I think that time is gone. But I do think that there is the idea of having a person who carries that vision or builds that vision based on his constituency and gives the town a sense of its future is a very important role. And right now, I don't think we have that. I think you've already discussed, so some people will say that's a mayor. Well, maybe it is. Or maybe it's a first selectman who's elected at large rather than appointed or chosen by the board. I don't know what the exact best governance arrangement is, but I do see more and more the need to separate these two functions, but to have them both. And right now, I think we don't have them both. Please.
Would you expect that to be a full-time position? Or just, because right now, obviously, our select board and every other officer of the town is a part-time, essentially a volunteer position.
Yeah.
Even though there's some pay, but it's, the pay is below minimum wage.
Yes. I think it's the kind of job that people would have to give as many hours to as they thought took to do the job and to get elected the next time. I do think they should have some sort of budget that they're in control of, even though it might be token, but I do think they need to have some ability to put money behind their ideas, even if it's only a small bit. So I don't know exactly the answer to your question. I would imagine, it's hard to see it as a full-time position where a person could take that on and where, frankly, we'd want to pay the salary for a full-time person to do it. But I do think that somehow that role is now neglected and that we need to advance it. Since I'm up here, there's one other thing I'm going to mention, and that is I really applaud your attempts to add accountability, both on the part of the select board members and the town manager. And I think I think what you're doing in terms of the possibility for recall or absenteeism being cause for dismissal is an excellent idea. I also think it is a disservice to the town manager not to provide periodic performance reviews. And I wholeheartedly endorse the idea of doing that. Having said that, I don't see any reason that a town manager who is performing satisfactorily in their job should be subject to any particular tenure requirements.
Could you explain that a little more? Meaning that
Well, I mean that I don't think, for example, that a town manager ought to have to reapply for his job every 4 years. I think he ought to get a performance review no later than every 2 years and probably every year. And certainly that might lead to a parting of the ways between the select board and the town manager, but I don't think there's any reason to say, we've got to change town managers every 6 years or any other kind of tenure restriction. because frankly, I don't think you'll get the quality of candidates that you want applying for the job if you do that.
We did discuss that, Bruce, that very issue of, being able to stay in a job if you're performing well. But one of the things I think, at least I can speak for myself, that I heard in the community was very similar to what you're saying about leadership. And the more my background has been usually in education on these kind of seats, but the more I went to some of these meetings on the TIF or went to things that the select board were presenting or suggesting, the more leadership that I actually saw with this select board as a group. And, maybe I'm naive to think that the TIF and the other things that came out over this last year were from the leadership of the select board and the town management, the people working for the select board or for the town to present these things. And so the accountability piece, I think we all heard from various constituents that, that somebody shouldn't just get a job and stay there for 25 years, that maybe we wrote in one of our recommendations is an annual review for that very reason. I think in most jobs you have a performance review. So I think we are listening to what people are saying. When we got to the town manager part, we discussed a mayor, and I think Mr. Therian did an article that most of us did not support a strong, in quotes, mayor at this time. And, I think we're open to hearing suggestions as we are looking for public input, and we will continue to do that till we finalize our review.
And I think when we use the term strong mayor as opposed to weak mayor, which has also been batted around, I think, look at a strong mayor as like Rutland, that the mayor is the town manager. And that, I think, is what we've more or less as a group, I believe, and I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but kind of felt that is not the right fit for Bennington.
And certainly, I know you'll have more discussions about it, and you'll hopefully come to a much more enlightened decision than I could, but I thought I'd offer my comments for you.
Well, I would say that your opinion is very enlightened, and I would say that, this is just, the fact that we're not making a recommendation for mayor is just the opinion of 7 of us. The charter allows the public to file a petition that I understand from a recent Banner article. There's a process that's in the works. So, you can make that argument if that petition ever comes to be and argue your point, and the community will decide. But in my opinion, that's one of the issues that I felt that we just didn't have enough information on to make any better decision than the community would make when the vote came out. So, thanks for your input.
Thank you.
Although I would say we did have the town council, he's a contractor, but the attorney that does deal with municipalities, and he came in and did quite an education for us on what other towns do. And some of the towns do exactly what you described, Bruce, with more of a PR idea mayor than an administrative mayor. So,
is anybody willing to come up and tell us why you don't think Bennington should have a mayor? Because we only had 2 hands go up. Is anyone willing to share your thoughts on that?
The other hand left.
I know. He's gone. But please.
I'm Bob Taggart from Elm Street. I'm a Flatlander. I've only been here a year. I'm trying to learn about Bennington and Vermont, how it works. And I really think this is great to see a board like this and a board like the Act 46 people. I mean, it's all good stuff. But I've lived in big communities, I've lived in small communities, and I know how complex it is to manage a community with environmental stuff and legal things, and you're working with multi-million-dollar budgets. I could not imagine not having a professional do that. I couldn't imagine having a Politico do that. I just think it's important to have a professional, almost like a civil engineer type that's going to run your community from that perspective. But I really was impressed with this, the bicycle fellow here. His approach that you need a balance. Maybe you need some kind of mayor that'd be the politician, to kiss the babies, to do whatever he's got to do, you know. But you need a balance. But I could not imagine managing a community, somebody that's elected every couple of years. You got to have consistency. You got to have some kind of professionalism. So that's all I got to say. But I'm learning, so bear with me.
Okay, thank you.
If I can just add a brief comment to that. I think this is a great discussion. My view is undecided about mayoralty versus select board and town manager, but the thing that I have said a number of times is if you go to a strong mayor system and you really are honor bound to make sure that you are confident that you will have competitive races with competitive candidates for at least the first 10 years, because you don't want to vote somebody into office that you don't like, and after 3 or 4 years, there's no suitable candidate. The kind of, and Bruce, I think you're absolutely right, that kind of leadership already exists in Bennington, and it exists, for example, in Tom D at the hospital, exists in business leaders, exactly the kind who do this well, but they don't have the time to take on a job like this. So there's a crazy balance involved in this about, you know, whether you have the stable full of people who can take on those political, charismatic, visionary leadership roles. And if you don't, going down that route doesn't make a lot of sense, because then you're just electing somebody for the hell of it.
Okay, I'm going to jump off of something John said earlier in terms of the voters themselves can petition to have a charter amendment. And also, we're not the gatekeepers of what the select board can do. The select board themselves can make that sort of recommendation. What the select board has done is they've put together this committee to make a recommendation to them. But just so that in terms of the process, this is not a necessary process for a charter amendment, but it's something that clearly gives more detail to the discussion. So, and is there any other comments from the board? Any other public comments?
We really value your opinion. Oh, yours too.
Just want to remember, I am not going to mention the town. I think we have been very deliberative, and I think we've worked well together. Several of us have said we're not signing up for a year for this. I will not mention the town, but I believe I'm correct in saying we have heard from a town that took 3 years to go through its charter to make recommendations. Well, that's a career that I just can't see myself doing, with all due respect. But I have great respect for my colleagues on this committee.
So one of the things that, you know, is my hope, and I believe the committee shares this, is that when we're done, we are hoping there is enough time between when we are finished and a vote that we are able to help the select board educate the public on what changes we're recommending and why we came to those conclusions, and that it's not rushed and it comes out 2 weeks before you know, you get the ballot in. I think that we owe it to the voters to be able to explain what the changes are and why. So I do think that I, like John, did not sign up for the 3-year haul. I wanted to, you know, take a look at it, get it out there, and this is why we meet weekly. And we've decided to have longer meetings once a month to try and get through more of it. And these forums to hear from citizens. And, you know, you've probably heard us say this, and it's been in the paper that there is a place you can put your comments in on the website. They then get forwarded to us. It does say that we, you know, you're not really going to get a response, but we will all see the comments. And again, the minutes of everything we've said every week. They're up there week by week. And we hope that when we're finished, the documents that we've worked on will also be up there. So are you sure the ones that didn't speak don't want to speak? No. You sure? Okay. Well, you can write to us.
Okay, and with that, I think we would need a formal motion to adjourn.
Before we do, I'll just mention the website. It's benningtonvt.org. So if anybody is interested in seeing the information, the bylaws, all the information on the town, benningtonvt.org.
That's the town website.
Yes.
We even have a little, like, tab now.
Charter committee icon.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank you,
coming.
everybody.
Thank you.